The story begins with four ordinary boys growing up in Liverpool: John, Paul, George, and Ringo. Though they come from humble backgrounds, they have big dreams of making it big with their music. They start out jamming in local venues as the Quarrymen, garnering a small following. But soon their melodic vocals, catchy guitar riffs, and fab haircuts capture the hearts of young fans across Britain. As Beetle Mania sweeps the nation, the Fab Four skyrocket to international stardom. They take America by storm, perform record-breaking concerts, and pioneer new recording techniques that revolutionize pop music. For several glorious years, the charismatic band dominated the airwaves and packed stadiums with their infectious tunes about love and peace. But even the tightest bonds can fray under pressure. Creative differences emerge that drive the Beatles apart, ending this magical era in music history. Though the dream ends, their legacy lives on. Do you want to know how to become the greatest band of all time? We've got you covered. Let's take a look at this incredible music journey. Our journey starts back in 1940s Liverpool, where John, Paul, George, and Ringo were just ordinary schoolboys. Far from the bright lights of London, Liverpool was a tough, industrial port city. Growing up, the boys' hard-scrabble roots seemed worlds away from the glitz of showbiz. But this gritty seaport would prove the perfect breeding ground for their career. Leading the pack was John Lennon, born in 1940 right as German bombs pummeled Liverpool. Paul McCartney and George Harrison followed in 1942 and 1943, arriving just as World War II was wrapping up. All three came from humble, working-class homes where luxuries were few and far between. Born in 1940, Ringo Starr grew up sickly and isolated until finding his passion for drumming. Little did these four teens know how fate would unite them to form the biggest band in history. In 1956, 16-year-old John formed a skiffle band called the Quarrymen with mates from school. The rebellious teen often got in trouble for sneaking beers into class and wisecracking at teachers. You could already see John's rock star attitude emerging. The following year, the studious 15-year-old Paul saw the Quarrymen play at a church social. He was introduced to John and blew him away by perfectly playing 20 Flight Rock on guitar. Paul's mastery at such a young age convinced John he'd be perfect for the band. But wait, do you know Paul's audition occurred at St. Peter's Church Garden Fete? It was the same place where John infamously had to play with his back to the audience after showing up drunk. 14-year-old George joined the band in 1958 as lead guitarist after being introduced by Paul. But since George and Paul were younger than the drinking age, they'd often have to take the bus and stand outside the pubs where the band played. After cycling through names like Johnny and the Moondogs and the Silver Beatles, the boys finally settled on the Beatles in 1960. Now, with drummer Pete Best, they headed to Hamburg and cut their teeth working grueling sets at seedy clubs like the Indra. Little did they know that those long nights in Germany would launch them on an incredible journey. The Beatles shot to stardom between 1961 and 1964 as Beetle Mania swept Britain and then the world. In 1961, they caught their big break when Brian Epstein, a local record store manager, checked out the band after hearing the buzz. He convinced George Martin at EMI Records to give the Beatles an audition. Martin was initially unimpressed by their stage show and Pete Best's drumming, but he saw potential in their wit and offered them a recording contract on one condition: they must replace Best with a better drummer. Enter Ringo Starr, whose quirky persona and steady rhythmic drive proved the perfect match. With the lineup solidified, the stars aligned for the Beatles in 1962. That October, their very first single, Love Me Do, was released in the UK and slowly climbed the charts to number 17. The modest hit garnered attention, but nobody could have predicted the utter Beetle Mania that exploded in 1963. As the Beatles kept churning out catchy tunes, their fan base of teens and young adults ballooned. Their music, look, and cheeky personalities perfectly captured the youthful spirit of the 1960s. When their single, Please Please Me, hit number 1 in March, all hell broke loose. Hordes of screaming girls mobbed them anytime they appeared in public.
And I'll always love them. Even when I'm 105 and an old grandmother, I'll love them.
It was utter hysteria. Beetle Mania had arrived. The band's debut album of the same name conveniently captured the buzz. It featured their early hits and Lennon-McCartney originals, which soared up the charts for 30 consecutive weeks at number 1. By year's end, their sophomore album with the Beatles also hit number 1, maintaining the delirious momentum of Beetle Mania. This album showed their songwriting rapidly maturing. Then came 1964, the year the Beatles went from UK stars to a global phenomenon. I Wanna Hold Your Hand gave them their first number 1 hit in America, ushering in full-scale Beetle Mania across the pond. When they arrived in New York, 3,000 frenzied fans greeted them at the airport. Their legendary appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show was watched by a record-shattering 73 million viewers, over 40% of the American population. Other U.S. highlights included jam-packed concerts in Washington, D.C. and New York's Carnegie Hall. Their first feature film, A Hard Day's Night, premiered to critical acclaim. Overseas, 10,000 Aussie fans mobbed the band in Adelaide. Similar scenes of hysteria greeted them everywhere from Sweden to the Netherlands as Beetle Mania went global. By the end of 1964, the Fab Four had released an astounding 6 number 1 albums and singles in the UK and 2 more in America. Beetle Mania had officially swept the world, making the Beatles household names. At the peak of their fame, from 1965 to 1967, the Beatles got increasingly experimental with their music and pushed the boundaries in the studio. Fresh off the success of A Hard Day's Night, they kicked off 1965 by filming their wacky spy parody Help in locations like the Austrian Alps and Bahamas. The zany movie mirrored the playful, carefree energy of the mid-60s, but off-screen, the Beatles were becoming more serious about their craft. Rubber Soul, released in December 1965, showed major creative growth. Their lyrics got more mature, touching on themes beyond just romance. Musically, their sophistication grew by leaps and bounds. Next came 1966's Revolver, which really saw them flex their creative muscles in the studio with George Martin. They pioneered innovative tape loops, sampling, and effects like ADT that gave their sound new textures. Exotic instruments like sitar and tabla on songs like Love You Do reflected the rising popularity of Indian music and culture. This experimentation laid the groundwork for their 1967 masterpiece, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Called by many the greatest album of all time, Sgt. Pepper's was revolutionary and influential in too many ways to count. It had an intricate concept and complex songwriting, with lyrical themes that were bold for pop. The band spent months painstakingly layering multiple takes together using splicing techniques to orchestrate their own mini symphonies. The result was an album of intricate depth that set a new bar for pop as serious art. In June 1967, at the height of the Summer of Love, the Beatles reached an estimated 400 million global viewers by broadcasting their new song, All You Need Is Love, via satellite. It was a defining moment that showcased them as the world's biggest band. But behind the scenes, cracks were forming. They stopped touring in 1966, partly due to tensions within the band. And in August 1967, their brilliant manager, Brian Epstein, who had shaped their image and guided their careers, died of an accidental drug overdose. His shocking death was the first major fracture of the Beatles organization. It occurred right as they were undergoing massive changes with their musical growth and exploration of mind-expanding drugs. Within a year, their longtime recording engineer Jeff Emerick would quit, exhausted by the infighting. As the Beatles dove deeper into psychedelia and the avant-garde on albums like Magical Mystery Tour, they were also drifting irrevocably apart. The cracks would only grow wider. By 1968, the once unshakable brotherhood between John, Paul, George, and Ringo was fracturing. The incredible pressures of their unprecedented fame had finally taken their toll. That year, the Beatles suffered their first real critical disappointment with the TV film Magical Mystery Tour. Though often surreal and psychedelic, it lacked a cohesive plot. The British press tore into it as self-indulgent folly. While the accompanying album fared better, it reflected the band's fragmentation. Each was pursuing more individual creative paths that didn't always mesh well together. Tensions exploded while recording 1968's White Album. In one heated exchange, Ringo temporarily quit after arguing with Paul. George also walked out for several days after a fight where John and Paul criticized his songs as subpar. Adding stress, John's whirlwind romance with avant-garde artist Yoko Ono caused major friction. His bandmates resented her constant presence in the studio, but John refused to be separated from her. Paul tried valiantly to keep his spirits high and productivity up, but after so many years living under a microscope together, nerves were badly frayed. Exhausted by the turmoil, the Beatles seriously considered ending the band for the first time. Were they simply outgrowing each other personally and creatively? Somehow, they rallied to record 1969's Abbey Road, a final masterpiece. But the fun and camaraderie was long gone. At the end of 1969, John privately informed the others he was leaving the band, though it was kept a secret from the press. Let It Be was actually the last album recorded, but since filming wrapped in January 1969, it sadly captured the band's tense final days. Quiet moments reveal how far they drifted apart. By 1970, all four Beatles were focused on solo work and publicly announced their breakup. The dream was over. Within a year, resentments festered into bitter legal battles over royalties and management. Ironically, the extraordinary fame and success the Beatles achieved together had sown the seeds of their destruction. Constant pressures ultimately fractured those once unbreakable bonds. The most successful partnership in pop music history was done in by the same forces that rocketed them to the toppermost of the poppermost. But even separated, the legacy of these four Liverpool men would live on eternally. The Beatles' story didn't end when the band split up. In fact, their legacy and influence continue making an impact decades later. While some music fads come and go, the Fab Four's tunes have stood the test of time. Their albums still top charts today and get discovered by new generations of fans. All told, the Beatles have sold an astronomical 600 million records worldwide, making them by far the best-selling band in the history of music. Now over half a century old, songs like Hey Jude, Let It Be, and Come Together remain staples on radio stations everywhere. They sound as fresh and moving now as the day they were recorded. And it's not just the senior set who still love the Beatles. Their idiosyncratic melodies, poetic lyrics, and creative chord changes influence young bands to this day. In fact, the Beatles are often rated as the most influential group by modern artists. Even legendary musicians like Bob Dylan and the Rolling Stones looked up to the Beatles and were inspired by their studio experiments. And stars like Taylor Swift and Ed Sheeran continue to pay homage to them. But the Beatles' impact extends far beyond pop charts and record sales. They were trailblazers who opened doors for rock bands to be taken seriously as artists. With genre-pushing albums like Revolver and Sgt. Pepper, they showed that pop music could be ambitious art. Nearly every artist strives to evolve, and the Beatles set the gold standard for creative growth. They continuously reinvented themselves, from the She Loves You days to their psychedelic trippy phase. This willingness to take risks paved the way for others. All these ripples show how enormously the Beatles shaped today's musical landscape. Over 50 years later, the group from Liverpool continues to inspire generations with their living legacy. From Liverpool juniors to international pop royalty, the Beatles' astronomical rise changed music forever. They mastered the art of crafting catchy pop hooks, pushed boundaries with bold experimentation, and wrote songs that still resonate more than 50 years later. Though they split bitterly in 1970, the revolutionary work remains immortal. The Beatles lived through an incredible journey full of soaring highs and painful lows. Their story is a reminder that even the closest partnerships can unravel. But it's also a testament to the magic that can happen when talent, ambition, and fate collide. If you're as inspired by the Fab Four's tale as I was, then be sure to watch my previous video on Taylor Swift. Just look for that red button down there and give it a big old smack. And remember to subscribe to Big Stories to discover the greatest tales from the world. Then you'll never miss out on the best stories. Until then, keep dreaming big and discover the biggest stories with us.